I would like to recognize a whole lot of young women who are with us today in response to the campaign to take a child to work, whereby the girl children have been following and shadowing some of the honorable members. You are welcome, and we recognize the fact that tomorrow you will be sitting here where I am, and one of you will be sitting where the president is sitting. So we welcome you. The secretary will read the first order of the day.
Resumption of debate on vote number 1, the presidency. Reply by the president. Appropriation bill.
The Honorable, the President of the Republic.
Madam Speaker,
What is the issue, Honorable
Madam Speaker,
Steenhuisen?
I'd like to address you in terms of Rule 92.2, if I may. At the commencement of yesterday's proceedings, I was promised a cigar. It hasn't arrived yet, and I certainly hope that the delivery from the President is going to improve significantly.
I hope so. Maybe the President will address that matter. The Honorable, the President.
Thank you. Thank you. Madam Speaker, ministers and deputy ministers, leaders of political parties here, honorable members, and our most distinguished guests, the girl children who are up there. As well as Mr. J. Garth T., the Minister of Railways from the Republic of Ghana. Mr. Steenhuisen, yesterday I had your cigar. But when I sought to offer it to you, standing here, you looked most unhappy. And I don't know what caused your unhappiness. So I donated it to someone else. Depending on how you and I do today, you will have a box of cigars from me. Madam Speaker, I wish to extend my gratitude to all the honorable members who participated in the debate on the budget vote of the presidency, vote 1. Yesterday's debate provided ample evidence of the dynamism of our democracy, of the ability of our institutions to give a platform to a diversity of views. It provided a valuable opportunity as well for representatives of the people of this country to articulate some of their views, interests, and expectations. It demonstrated that we disagree often vigorously, but we are bound together by a determination to make South Africa work. We are bound together by a desire for a South Africa that has confronted many divisions of the past and sought to heal them. We are bound together by a set of constitutional principles and values that clearly differentiate our democratic present from our horrible apartheid past. Several speakers yesterday spoke of nation building and the need for reconciliation. The achtbare Groenewald.
The Honorable Groenewald said that
that we are all South Africans that must build this country, and I agree with it. In the same measure, we are all South Africans, and we have an equal responsibility, and that is unity and reconciliation.
All of us have an equal responsibility to foster unity and reconciliation, and not just unity and reconciliation in name, but unity and reconciliation in real effect. That requires that we recognize both the injustices of the past, but also recognize how the legacy of that injustice endures and continues in social and economic terms to the present. When we talk about white privilege and black poverty, Honorable Maimani, we are not only talking about the past, we are also talking about the present. And we need to recognize that this present was caused by what happened in the past. It did not arrive today or just yesterday. It existed in the past, and we are in this situation because of what was done to our people in the past. We cannot build a united nation unless we fundamentally change that material reality. We cannot achieve reconciliation until we have torn down the barriers that still divide us. The drafters of the National Development Plan said that there is still much that divides us, and we are still divided by the past or the barriers that were put up in the past. Some of those barriers exist today, and some of them exist in people's minds. They exist in the people who think that it is still acceptable to sing, destem, and display the old South African flag. These are not symbols of Afrikaner identity. They are symbols of discrimination, oppression, misery, and still wanting to go back to the past. These barriers exist in the minds of those who would deny that apartheid was a crime against humanity. These barriers exist in the minds of those who measure people's worth by their race, people who measure people's worth by their gender, their language, their ethnic group, class, or income. These barriers also exist in the landscape of our country between those who live in the rural areas and those who live in the urban areas, and those who live in the former homelands and those who live in cities and towns, between those who live on the periphery of those who live in the center of things. And these barriers exist in people's daily conditions of life, between those who have jobs and those who are unemployed, between those who are skilled and those who do not have skills, and between those who have assets and those who have no assets at all. As we work to build a united nation, we need to tear down these barriers that prevent women from occupying their rightful place in society. This was a matter that Minister Dlamini raised very sharply and directly yesterday. We tend to think that nation building is about reconciling black and white South Africans, yet it is also about reconciling men and women. It is about achieving equality in the home, at schools, in colleges, and in universities, in the workplace, and also in this parliament. in government, and in every public institution. In every area of government work, there is a need to give specific attention to the representation of women, whether it is in the Black Industrialist Program, our public employment programs, infrastructure development, public procurement, or small business support. We need to prioritize the education of the girl child and remove the impediments that prevent these wonderful young ladies from completing their schooling and advancing to higher education and training. Government is doing much in this regard, but it is quite clear that we need to do more. We need to build on programs like She Conquers campaign, increasing its reach and its impact across the country. Today is Take a Girl Child to Work, an initiative that demonstrates to the girls of this country that their rightful place in society is wherever their dreams can take them to. If your dream one day, young ladies, is to become members of parliament, maybe you will even become better members than parliament than all of us. If your dream is to become a minister of government, maybe you will even become a much better minister of government. If your dream is to become a scientist, maybe you can even be better scientists than we have. We welcome the learners who are here today. We are hopeful that from among this group will emerge a new generation, yes, of educators, doctors, pilots, ready to take up the needs and interests of our people. We are hopeful that from among this group will emerge enormously talented people. Our Constitution envisages a state founded on the principles of dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms. As we work together to overcome the divisions of race, gender, and class that have characterized our country over decades, we often overlook the discrimination, oppression, and disempowerment of people with disabilities. The Honorable Nieuho Drachen yesterday said much to us about this area of work. And the ANC government has done much to advance the rights and opportunities of people with disabilities over the past 24 years. But it is equally true that from what she was saying, we have not done enough. Our approach needs to begin with a greater awareness of the challenges facing people with disabilities and how this should impact on the way we design public infrastructure, public buildings, how we provide public services, our recruitment and human resource management practices, and our approach to procurement and enterprise development. We must, in particular, attend to the specific needs of people with different forms of disability within our education and health systems. It is not enough for every department, public entity, company, and private organization to have a policy on disability. They need to have programs, real programs that affirm and empower people with disabilities. This we must do because people with disabilities are like all of us. They have rights that, like all of us, we must therefore do right by them. The mandate of this government is to tear down barriers between those who have and those who do not. It is in fulfillment of that mandate that we have embarked on a massive, far-reaching investment drive. As we have said before, we are seeking to mobilize investment from within South Africa, from elsewhere on the African continent, from Asia, from the Middle East, from Europe and the Americas. We are seeking investment from private companies, from sovereign wealth funds, and from public entities. This is not a 1996 class project. This is about addressing what can create jobs in our country. We have had several meetings with CEOs of some of the largest state-owned enterprises, where they have given us an indication of their investment plans over the coming years. They have informed us that over the next 5 years, they expect to invest a total of 420 billion rand into the South African economy. We are seeking investment that expands the industrial capacity of our economy, that creates jobs on an unprecedented scale, and that lifts millions of our people out of poverty. This is not an elite project. It is what I would call a revolutionary project. It is revolutionary because, taken together with other programs that we are involved in this government, it promises to fundamentally alter the economic conditions of the majority of South Africans. Investment, clearly in itself, is not a guarantor of growth nor of job creation. But without investment, neither of these will even be possible. Countries that succeed, and we see them as we travel all over, are countries that are generating investments from within themselves as countries and externally as well. As we have said before, the creation of jobs, the reduction of inequality and the eradication of poverty, and indeed the success of investment is dependent on our ability to create the distortion, to correct rather, the distortions of the apartheid legacy. This includes our intensive efforts to address the huge skills deficit in our country by ensuring access to the children of the poor to quality education from ECD level right through to higher education and training. It includes our efforts to provide our people with houses, with land and other assets so that they may break the cycle of poverty through which poverty is passed from one generation to the next. Land reform is therefore fundamental to the eradication of poverty. It is fundamental to restoring the dignity of all South Africans, to foster reconciliation and to forge national unity. It is for this reason that this government, guided by the resolutions of the 54th National Conference of the governing party, is undertaking measures to accelerate the redistribution of land, the extension of security of tenure, the provision of agricultural support, and the redress of spatial inequality. We need to unlock the economic potential of this country's land. If ownership, tenure, and the use of this country's land remains restricted to a small minority, as it is today, we will never realize the contribution it can make to the growth and development of our economy. If poor people cannot own property, the most prized possession of any household is a house or a piece of land property. And if they cannot own a property and live close to the economic centers of our towns and cities, the cost of living will forever remain as high as the cost of looking for a job. That is why we must use every means at our disposal to make this happen. We have no other choice, and in fact, on our side, it is a historic duty and responsibility to restore the imbalances of the past. That is why we will not relent in our determination to use, yes, expropriation without compensation as one of the mechanisms to effect land reform. We do so understanding that expropriation without compensation is not an end in itself, but a means to an end. As we must therefore use it, we must therefore use it in a manner that advances the objectives of meaningful, radical, and sustainable land redistribution. Madam Speaker, during the debate yesterday, both the Honorable Maimane and Honorable Malema introduced into this House a figure that is known as a straw man. The dictionary definition of a straw man is an intentionally misrepresented proposition that is set up because it is easier to defeat than an opponent's real argument. The Ramaphosa definition of a straw man is a fake policy conjured up by a desperate party in order to make a false claim. Both Honorable Maimane and Honorable Malema have sought to misrepresent the position of the ANC on the issue of expropriation of land. However, if you go through the resolutions of the ANC's 54th conference, its January 8th statement, the State of the Nation address, replies to questions in this House and recommendations of the ANC's recent land workshop, there is a clear and consistent thread. We will not be diverted from the path we are on. We will not shy away from engaging in debate. We will engage, we will consult, and we will seek to build consensus. But we will not compromise on our determination to resolve the land question in this country once and for all. You are therefore invited to join us in this effort to make sure that the decisions that are taken are decisions that are owned by the people of this country. The restoration of the land to the poor and dispossessed through a constitutionally mandated program of redress and reform is a revolutionary act. The illegal occupation of land is not. We must remind ourselves why we have a constitution and why we value the rule of law. It is to protect the poor and the vulnerable from the arbitrary exercise of power, to prevent a repeat of the abuses and the violations of the past. Our Constitution is an instrument of radical transformation. We should treasure it, we should safeguard it, and we should use it to achieve fundamental social and economic change. A number of speakers also, Madam Speaker, touched on the crucial issue of governance and the need to build a capable and developmental state. Some honorable members would have us believe that this is simply a matter of the size of the cabinet. It is, I regret to say, much more than that. The reconfiguration of the state is a far greater and more ambitious undertaking that must go to the heart of the capacity of government to meet the country's developmental needs. We need to address issues of structure, not just of national departments, but of all spheres and all public institutions. We also need to address issues of efficiency, effectiveness, as well as resource allocation. Not only must we end all fruitless, wasteful, irregular, and unauthorized expenditure, but we must also make sure that the money we budget is allocated to programs that have the greatest beneficial impact. Budgeting is about making choices. We need to have the capacity, the data, and the political will to make the right choices. As Minister Dlamini Zuma said, we are working to establish an institutional framework to integrate planning across government and ensure alignment between national, provincial, local government planning and other sectors. We are working to improve our capacity to monitor and evaluate the work of all areas of the state and to employ the great advances that have been made in information technology to better understand and analyze the wealth of data that is available about our country and its people. We need to address, yes, the culture of government. It has been several years since we introduced the Batupele principles, but adherence to these principles is inconsistent. The vast majority of public servants are very, very conscientious. They are honest and committed. But in too many parts of the state, the experience of our people leaves a lot to be desired. That is why we are working to do things differently, to promote efficiency, to encourage a culture of performance, and to find opportunities for public servants to deepen their skills as well as their experience. We have heard honorable members describe the situation in many of our frontline departments, those that provide essential services to our citizens. There are indeed areas of great concern, and these areas are matters that we want to prioritize. Our health system is truly under great strain. As the Minister of Health has said, the Public Health Service takes care of 80% of the people in the country, including large numbers of immigrants. We have nevertheless managed to initiate 4 million people on HIV antiretroviral treatment, deliver more than 1 million babies a year, and provide treatment to 300,000 people with tuberculosis annually. The increased burden of disease that our country is bearing now, and our attempts to treat as many people as possible, has increased the pressure on the public health system. One sees it as one goes to hospitals. Recently, I went to Tembisa Hospital, and just simply being taken to the neonatal side of the hospital and being told by specialists and doctors and nurses that they've run out of space, and almost 60% of the babies that are born, as I said earlier, are born to mothers who are from outside our country. Our country has become an oasis, not only for economic advancement, but also for health treatment. A ministerial team identified common problems in different hospitals around the country, primarily in human resources, financial management, procurement and the supply chain, as well as maintenance of infrastructure and equipment. The National Health Department is dispatching teams to turn around poorly performing hospitals. It is undertaking work to fill vacant posts and contracting private health practitioners to provide specific services. to reduce the burden of disease and therefore the pressure on clinics and hospitals, we are in the process of strengthening community-based health services. Madam Speaker, one area that particularly concerned honorable members was the report of the Auditor General that he has presented, where he said that there is a regression in the overall audit outcomes of municipalities in years 2015-16 and 2016-17. This reinforces the observation we made yesterday that there has been an increase in the number of municipalities that are in dire state. The Department of Cooperative Governance and the National Treasury have begun working together on a structured and coordinated approach to support financially distressed and dysfunctional municipalities. Working together with provinces, their joint response focuses on 3 of the 5 pillars of the Back to Basics initiative, namely institutional and administrative capacity, good governance, and sound financial management. Municipalities are being supported to implement robust improvement plans, which will be monitored closely by the departments. The departments are working to address the reality that, truth be told, some municipalities are failing at effectively delivering services, billing for services, and collecting revenue that is due. And some municipalities are municipalities that simply do not have a tax base and yet still have to provide services to our people. A simplified revenue plan is being implemented to improve revenue management, reduce municipal consumer debt, and enhance municipalities' revenue collection potential. This work will feed into and be reinforced by the Presidential Local Government Summit, for which preparations are underway. Honorable members, several speakers yesterday also raised the issue of violence and crime, which continues to deny our people the peace and the security that they deserve as citizens of our country, a peace they need and indeed demand. As we indicated yesterday, we have made several important appointments to strengthen police management, including the appointment of a new Divisional Commissioner for Crime and Intelligence, and yesterday, a new head of the Hawks. It is hoped that these critical appointments will strengthen the criminal justice cluster, and the police will be able to infiltrate syndicates and arrest syndicate members, particularly those who are involved in organized crime and those who are now perpetrating these cash heists all the time. The Minister of Police has instructed the police management to conduct preventative crime intelligence-driven operations in dealing with serious and violent crimes such as armed robberies, cash heists, and murders. I have appointed an interministerial committee comprising of Ministers of Defense, Police, State Security, and Justice to address the problem of political killings in KwaZulu-Natal. The IMC has begun meeting key stakeholders in the province and is expected to present a comprehensive report by the end of the month on measures to end these killings and to bring those who are responsible for these killings to book. From all these contributions yesterday, Madam Speaker, even from among the doubters, it is clear that we have entered a new era. It is a new era that holds much promise for renewal, growth, and transformation, but it will only succeed if we all work together to make it a true reality. It will only succeed if we put aside our narrow interests and pursue the shared future that the people of this country desire. Ons is almal Suid-Afrikaners, wat hierdie land saam moet bou. Sisonke sifanele ukuthi sakhe iNingizimu Afrika. We are all South Africans and we have a common responsibility. I wish to conclude by expressing my gratitude to ministers in the Presidency, Minister Dlamini Zuma and Dlamini, as well as the DG, Dr. Cassius Lubisi, Acting DDG Busani Ngaweni, my advisors, Secretariat members, staff, directors, protectors, for enabling me to do this work. Lastly, and it is a pity that Honorable Malema is not here, I wish to thank my family and my wife especially, and to inform Honorable Malema, that the First Lady had a knee operation almost 3 months ago. And she had a knee operation called arthroplasty, something like that. She has not been able to walk properly for the past 3 months. And later she started walking on crutches, and now she has started walking on her operated foot. So, Honorable Malema, there is nothing wrong. She has just not been well. She will soon be making her contribution, particularly in her area of speciality, early childhood development. And Honorable Malema, I therefore invite you to visit some early child development center where you might be able to meet her as you so admire her. Thank you very much.
I thank the President. The Secretary will read the last order of the day.
Debate on Africa Day, the legacy of Mr. Nelson Mandela in building a better Africa and a better world.
Madam Speaker.
Yes, Honorable Steenhuisen.
Madam Speaker, I take it was a case of close but no cigar.
Well, it sounds like it was quite close. I call on the Minister in the Presidency for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. President of the Republic, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, honorable members, I'm honored to speak before you on this special day, on Africa Day. It was indeed on the 25th of May, 1963, when 32 free African countries came together to establish the Organization of African Unity, which was transformed to the African Union, launched in Durban in 2002. Madam Speaker, long before the cross-Atlantic slave trade, the partitioning of Africa in Berlin, and colonialism, Africa had its own kingdoms, states, and civilization. The peoples of Africa thereafter accelerated the growth of the global Pan-Africanist movement, which united Africans and their descendants in the diaspora against slavery, colonialism, racial oppression, and apartheid. The 5th Pan-Africanist Congress held in Manchester in 1945 with prominent Pan-Africanists like W.E. Du Bois, George Padmore, Kwame Nkrumah, John Kenyatta, amongst others, was a pacemaker for decolonization in Africa and the Caribbean. They took a very important decision that Africa had to be freed in 50 years. And that gave the impetus towards the formation of the OAU and to the liberation of Africa. And indeed, South Africa was the last within that 50 years. Thanks to their efforts, Africa today is free except Western Sahara. Apartheid and colonialism did a lot also to damage our mindsets, our self-esteem, besides our freedom. I want to quote from Steve Biko about this matter. I quote, "In an effort to destroy completely the structures that have been built upon an African society and to impose the imperialism with an unnerving totality, the colonialists were not satisfied with merely holding people in their grip and empty the native brain of all form and content. They turned to the past of the oppressed people and distorted it, disfigured and destroyed it. No longer was reference to African culture. It became barbarism. Africa was the dark continent. Religious practices and customs were referred to as superstition. No wonder the African child learns to hate his heritage in his school today. A people without a positive history is like a vehicle without an engine. They always live in the shadow of a more successful society." And I just wanted to quote this because it's important for our children to have a mindset that believes in themselves and not believe that colonialism was an advantage as we are told. Madam Speaker, it was indeed in Ethiopia where President Mandela first received his military training and received his first pistol. He was trained by the Ethiopian army, and we must acknowledge that South Africa's history is very intertwined with that of Ethiopia, with that of the continent. Honorable Speaker, it was Malume Julius Nyerere who was at the forefront of the OAU and the Liberation Committee, which was tasked to end apartheid and all forms of colonialism on the continent, who said in 1997, after the end of apartheid in Namibia and South Africa, I quote, "My generation led Africa to political freedom. The current generation of leaders and peoples of Africa must pick up the flickering torch of African freedom, refuel it with their enthusiasm and determination, and carry it forward." Close quote. Indeed, this generation has picked up the torch through their Agenda 2063, adopted in 2014, representing the aspirations of all Africans and certainly South African hopes of men, women, young and old. Madam Speaker, Africa has a huge potential. It is a huge continent, and indeed sometimes the map does not do justice to it. We can fit in the landmass of Africa, Western Europe, China, United States, India, and there will be still space for Japan and a few islands. Our oceanic space is even larger, 3 times that of our size. The African rainforest is the biggest, second to the Amazon, and it is the second biggest lung of the world. We are endowed with both variety and abundance of living things. 1/4 of the world's mammals live in Africa. We have 60% of world's uncultivated arable land. Its forest resources cover for 23% of its land. We have plenty of mineral resources. platinum, diamonds, gold, chromium, bauxite, uranium, and almost a third of our countries have oil and gas. So Africa is rich, but Africans are poor. That's the paradox, Mr. President, that we must resolve, of poor Africans and a rich Africa. Indeed, this generation is in the process of creating a united, prosperous, and peaceful Africa driven by its citizens and playing a dynamic role in the international arena through the implementation of Agenda 2063. Our development trajectory in South Africa as part of Africa is very intertwined with the development and prosperity of our continent. South Africa is committed, obviously, to seeing Africa as a whole become one of the best continents. Seeing that we are celebrating this Africa Day under the theme of Madiba and centenary of Albertina Sula, I just want to quote from Madiba. I quote, "Africa, more than any other continent, has had to contend with the consequences of conquest in a denial of its own role in history, including the denial that its people had the capacity to bring about change and progress. Today, the world knows better. The mist that obscured our vision has been uplifted." Indeed, Africa is on the rise, Mr. President and Madam Speaker. It has had sustained growth of 5% for over a decade. Investments, both public and private, as well as foreign direct investments, are growing. Intra-African trade, including in industrial goods, are growing, especially in West, Southern, and Eastern Africa. Honorable Speaker, as we look at what to do today and in the next 45 years, we are determined as Africans to silence the guns on the continent, eradicate poverty in one generation, eradicate hunger, fragility, and disease, transform our economies, create jobs, build shared prosperity, preserve our environment, and deal with the challenges of climate change, and to foster tolerance, inclusive, just, non-sexist, and democratic societies. Madam Speaker, as Africans, we have to invest in our people, skills revolution, our young Africans in science, technology, research and innovation, and other disciplines. We must grow agricultural production and agro-processing to eradicate hunger and malnutrition, become the net exporter of food as a continent by modernizing our agriculture, use our indigenous knowledge to empower especially women and smallholder farmers, improve access to land, technology, extension services, markets, capital, developing infrastructure, especially energy, transport, ICT, and using modern technology to leapfrog development and extend universal access to education and health. Develop manufacturing, beneficiation of its natural resources, and the service sector. Grow intra-Africa and global trade so as to create jobs and build shared prosperity. We want foreign direct investment to contribute.
All right, we're cutting out of Parliament because everything is happening at the same time this afternoon. We are going to take you live to the Reserve Bank in a little while. But first, the Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo now briefing the media, briefing the nation about where the State Capture Commission is. Of course, it hasn't begun its full probe, but everyone wants to know where that commission is right now since its establishment. Here is the Deputy Chief Justice.
We are. But before we do that, I am going to ask the Secretary of the Commission, Dr. De Vere, to deal with one item. But before actually he does so, you will see that the people that are sitting with me here are people mostly that you saw at the previous media briefing, but there will be two that
that is peaceful at peace with itself and take its rightful place in the world. Mr. President, Africa's prosperity will mean increase in global prosperity. It will mean innovation. It will mean increased trade. But for us to increase inter-African trade, it's important that we industrialize. Industrialization will indeed create the necessary jobs, because at the moment, we African countries, including ourselves, are very vulnerable to the vagrancies of commodities and their prices. And if we beneficiate our mineral resources, we can be price callers rather than price takers. And I think this is very important for Africa as a whole. And therefore, Madam Speaker, as we celebrate Africa Day and the 55th anniversary of the founding of the African Union, we must look back, but most importantly, carry the torch of a prosperous, peaceful Africa and South Africa forward with determination and courage. We must ensure that our young people not only are proud of being Africans, but understand and are taught African history in the schools. Indeed, as we celebrate this day under the theme of a year of Nelson Mandela, building a better Africa, a better world, it is without doubt that Mandela would have been very proud that South Africa is at the forefront of celebrating Africa Month and Africa Day, and remains committed to the unity of Africa. Our forebearers taught us unity, solidarity, and indeed, we must look at how South Africa relates to the rest of Africa and to the rest of Africans who live in Africa, in South Africa. Just as we, you know, Mr. President, when I lived in Ethiopia, when there was that horrible incident here, the Ethiopians said, well, South Africans are doing this to our Ethiopians in South Africa. What do they expect us to do to South Africans who are here? So did the Nigerians, so did others say. So I think we need to look at this very carefully and manage it very carefully. But happy Africa Day. We are very proud to be Africans. I thank you.
Rem Khalapa, ke a gago nako ra.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker. As Africans, we are celebrating the 55th anniversary of the formation of the African Union. We salute our founding fathers, including Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, Modibo Keita, who had all a vision of a prosperous, peaceful, developed continent of Africa. It is still a dream and vision we all aspire to. As Kwame Nkrumah said, and I quote, "I'm not an African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me," I close quote. On the other hand, it is also the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an historic document that still today calls on Africa to rise and reach its own destiny, and to declare that human rights will be at the center of African identity. Africa must rise above the zero-sum game of inward-focused, racial, nationalist, and populist movements. Africa is also affected by the global challenges of immigration, modern-day slavery, security, terrorism, and extremism, which will require an innovative solutions if we are to overcome. Similarly, our own challenges of underdevelopment, poverty, and inequality require a new breed of bold, visionary leaders like Madiba of unquestionable integrity. Since the founding of the African Union 55 years ago, noticeable progress have been achieved. Africa boasts 5 of the fastest growing economies according to the World Economic Forum report, and some of the world's most renowned intellectuals, writers, sportsmen, artists, and musicians, and statesmen hails from Africa. The aspirations of basic services, including ICT, water, electricity, health, and education, have been progressively realized. Our youth population is our greatest asset, a pool of potential and human capital. Some of the key values of the African Union, like self-determination, political and economic rights, sovereignty, independence, and development, are increasingly being pursued. The African Peer Review Mechanism and the new Partnership for Africa Development, founded 15 years ago, are beginning to yield results, with more countries sharing best practices and voluntarily reviewing each other through governance assessments and promotion tools in order to stimulate economic, social, political, and corporate governance. We encourage more African states to participate in this review. Agenda 2063 envisions an Africa paradigm shift of inclusive economic growth, sustainable development, an integrated continent, good governance, democracy, justice, human rights, rule of law, and peace and security for Africa. And yet, Deputy Speaker, Africa still has its own fair share of challenges and shortcomings, including the longest-serving dictators who act with impunity and continue to abuse both human rights and the resources of its people. We need only look at the mass murderer al-Bashir. The civil wars, genocide, political intolerance, and arbitrary arrest of political opponents, to name a few examples. There is also the use of illegal mechanisms, including the arbitrary declaration of a state of emergency, as well as the suppression of the freedoms of association, speech, and media. We have witnessed the amendments of the constitutions to allow leaders to stay on in power, as recently was done in Burundi and Rwanda. A significant concern is also the democracy deficit due to the rigging of elections and circumventing the will of the people, leading to violence and displacement of people. This is against the principles espoused by the African Charter on Elections, Democracy, and Good Governance. For Africa to reach its full potential, it must unlock its intra-Africa trade, which remains low. The finalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area is long overdue. It requires political will and decisive action on trade barriers and the infrastructure backlog. The African Union member states must respect international institutions like the International Criminal Court by remaining members of the Rome Statute to ensure justice for human rights atrocities. The African Court of Justice and the African Human Rights Commission needs to be strengthened and made independent in order to fulfill their mandates free from political pressure. As Africa transforms itself into the next generation, we must respond to the globalized digital era. We must ensure democratization through free and fair elections, as well as good economic and political governance to ensure development and self-sustainability if we are to drive our own destiny. As I conclude, Deputy Speaker, as we celebrate the centenary of Madiba's legacy of building a better Africa and a better world by vehemently fighting for democracy, freedom, justice, racial equality, and reconciliation, we need to strengthen our resolve to make human rights the guiding principle of our foreign policy. Africa will be liberated through its young lions who recognize that their destiny is in their own hands and not in the psychological trap of the past, whether colonial, slavery, imperial, nor in the hands of liberation parties who have lost their vision and run out of ideas. The future is in the liberation of Africa through the values of democracy, the rule of law, the free market economy, human rights, political freedoms, and the fight against corruption. This will ensure that we achieve the Africa we want, of which Kwame Nkrumah declared, Africa is one continent, one people, and one nation, with African solutions for our African challenges. Africa rise. I thank you.
Honorable Mkhuleko Hlengwa.
Thank you, my Honorable Deputy Speaker. Honorable Minister Dlamini Zuma correctly pointed out that children in schools and so on are being taught to hate Africa and so on and so forth. But I put it to the minister and actually in agreeing with her that those that hate us are not those who are not us, but we hate ourselves. How do we reconcile the fact that former President Mohlante over the weekend called traditional leaders tin pot dictators? Does in this he include Nkosi Tul? Does in this category include Nkosi Mandela, whom this debate is actually after? Does in this include those traditional leaders whom the ANC asked to be patrons in 1912? Well, obviously something is fundamentally wrong if we are able to embrace foreign traditional leadership in the forms of royalties and queens and monarchs from around the world, and we are the ones to hate our own here at home. It would serve the ANC well to rein in the former president with this continued assault on traditional leadership, because it's totally unacceptable and totally uncalled for, but importantly, totally un-African. At the outset, Honorable Deputy Speaker, let me congratulate the IFP on a resounding victory in the Mtwatwa by-election yesterday in Ward 4, where the IFP took a ward from the ANC. It is indeed a good day for democracy and a good day for African democracy, to say the least. Today marks an auspicious occasion in which I would like to celebrate more than just our beautiful continent, our melting pot of culture and diversity, but more importantly, our youth, our science and our ability to be leaders in innovation. The total land area of our continent spans across 29.6 million square kilometers, in which over 1.2 billion of us reside, making up 16.9% of the global population, and more importantly, the median age of our people is 19 years old. Africa is indeed the future. We must begin to look at Africa through the lens of the future. We are at the forefront of shaping our realities and crafting our own narrative as we contend to become market leaders in science and innovation. We are a population that is young, dynamic, entrepreneurial, and contributing in almost every sector to address socio-economic challenges on our continent. The African innovation may long have been understated, but we certainly are game changers. Young people shall rise, and they have risen, and they will remain woke in the challenges we face. We, the African youth, will rise through adversity and will remain resolute. We, the African youth, will no longer accept mediocrity and will no longer tolerate a wholesale grab of our brand as a continent by others who try to make us feel inferior. According to the latest African Economic Outlook, more people are starting businesses in Africa than in Latin America and other countries. 20% of the new African entrepreneurs are introducing new products and services in Africa. In all of this, Africa is alive with possibility, and at the forefront of that possibility is young people. So on this Africa Day, let us say youth to the front and make sure that we give the youth proper education, build infrastructure, create jobs, and build an Africa that is going to the future and not an Africa of the past. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Deputy Speaker, Honorable members of the House. Honorable Deputy Speaker, today's debate affords us as the House a unique opportunity to reflect on the role, the influence, and the impact of a true patriot, a visionary, a revolutionary, and political colossus on building a better Africa and a better world. Tata Madiba knew that Africa was not free if most of all countries of Africa were still landless and found themselves displaced and taken as beggars in the land of their own. Nelson Mandela knew that without property ownership and land ownership and place of abode, South Africans and Africans were not free. Tata Madiba knew that we were not free when we were jobless and languished in hunger and poverty and looking like beggars and nomads in the lands of our ancestors. But like Dr. Julius Nyerere, he taught us that we need to help ourselves, as Dr. Julius Nyerere taught us the philosophy of self-help and self-reliance. Madiba taught us, South Africans and Africans, that we have to be bold to die for what we believe in. Like Dr. Martin Luther King, he said, quote, "If a man is not prepared to die for what he believes in, is not fit to live," unquote. And Dr. Martin Luther King again once said, "A man has not begun to live if he lives within the confines of his own individual, but has started to live if he lives for other people." As we celebrate Africa Day, we are reminded of the fact that more than 500 million peoples of the world, and those in Africa and those in diaspora, are languishing in poverty and unemployment. More than 70% of the people in sub-Saharan Africa are still confronted with HIV/AIDS scourge. We see several demonstrations in South Africa, in the East, and in Latin American countries. We see conflict and wars around the world, and I'm sure Madiba wouldn't have loved this. And the HIV/AIDS pandemic and poverty still plague Africa. Yet Madiba fought for a better Africa and a better world. Africa has land, has mineral resources, energy, gas, yet most of the countries of Africa die of hunger and poverty and diseases like malaria. Today we sit here, Honorable Deputy Speaker, the Auditor General in the report has said that more than 45 billion is reported irregular, fruitless and wasteful expenditure in the 2017-2018 financial year. Yet we have so many people who are homeless, poor, jobless, and have no roads, water, and electricity. Madiba gave the world and a better Africa, and a visionary leadership. Africa is plagued by wars, terrorist attacks, corruption, greed, fraud, and poor governance, and violation of basic human rights, and leaders who cling tenacious to power for far too long. Africa has reached in many things that he has not come together to condemn human trafficking, murder, and raping of women, killing of children, and all forms of genocide. And as the NFP, we support the African Development Bank initiative.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Wanko, Honorable.
Well, I would like to start this debate with a quote. Former President Kgalema Motlanthe once posed an important question that those who consider themselves to be the inheritors of Nelson Mandela's dream should consider seriously. And I quote, he said, "The litmus test, however, is whether inheritors of Nelson Mandela's dream of democracy, as to his vision and in adherents of his philosophy, will be able to make the dream for which he lived come to pass in the fullness of time." We've taken that upon ourselves as young people. We've established a group of young parliamentarians that seek to promote democracy and human rights in Africa. As we speak, Speaker, on the 29th and the 30th of June, we are going to have a regional symposium of young parliamentarians who seek to promote democracy and human rights so that we all become ambassadors of democracy and human rights. But we are taking it seriously that we have an important contribution and role to play in the cause of building a better Africa. The other issue which I think is important, Speaker, is that we continue in Africa to have leaders who want to cling to power at all costs. So desperate are these leaders, they get to the point where they would even amend constitutions. They amend their constitutions willy-nilly to remove the term limits. Some, they want to remove the age limits, like for example in Uganda. If you're looking at what happened in Burundi recently, where a referendum was even held to try and extend the term limit of the president. Now Nkurunziza, bad as he is for his country, he might stay in power until 2034. The other problem is that look at the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Democratic Republic of Congo. That chap there, Kabila, I'm sorry, I have no respect for him, continues to treat people with utter disdain, very repressive. killing them. Recently, he even shot at the Catholic Church, shot tear gas into churches, shot at demonstrators who were demonstrating and marching peacefully. And their only sin is that they were demanding that what he must do is that he must set a date for elections. As these young parliamentarians, we received a letter yesterday from the Catholic bishops. They were saying, I want to quote this letter before I sit down to show that we are doing something about the problems facing the continent. They say, Honorable Kwankwa, so in today's national political turmoil in our country, which stems from the failure of the governing party to organize elections, when the second last mandate of President Kabila ended, there is no better strategy than to keep the pressure on by using all non-violent means to ensure that our fundamental human rights are respected. He even goes on and says, to achieve these goals, we need helping hands from friends and associates throughout the world, like yourselves. He says South Africa needs to speak up. What we've done, Honorable Speaker, we've arranged for them to come to South Africa to talk to their counterparts here because the issue of inclusive dialogue before the elections is very important and we feel very strongly about it. We've written a letter to President Ramaphosa as the chairperson of SADC saying we need to facilitate inclusive dialogue before the elections that take place. It's important. That is what these different stakeholders want.
I'm afraid
you can't just declare elections in your vote and say, thank you ever so much, Siabule.
Honorable Mulder.
Honorable Speaker, Honorable Deputy Speaker, colleagues, I think the electorate should start off by taking note today that the economic freedom fighters who are quick to make a lot of noise in this House are boycotting the debate on Africa Day today. Why are they not in the House? Why are they not participating in this debate? The EFF needs to explain why they are not here. Honourable Chairperson, last week during the debate on Home Affairs, the Honourable Chauke from the ANC made the following point. I was in the discussion and I pointed out when I returned to South Africa from Europe how pleasantly I was treated at the airport when I went through with my passport in comparison to what I experienced in a certain country in Europe. And I said all of us with non-European passports for the European Union had to go through a certain process, and we all went through that. And he thought he had a bright moment, and he said, for the first time, I have acknowledged that I'm not European. And I said to the Honourable Chauke, you are wrong. In my maiden speech 30 years ago, I made the point that I'm not European, I'm an African. I am an African. And if I have to speak in racial terms, then I'm a white African. I'm part and parcel of this continent. After this debate, colleagues, if you go back to the Old Assembly lobby, you'll see the flags hanging there of all the African countries, 55 flags. They are hanging there right now. If you look at our political parties, we all know that the Democratic Alliance is associated with the color blue, the EFF with the color red. My party, the Freedom Front Plus, we've chosen the color green. And why did we do that? Go and have a look at those flags and you'll find the color green in 44 of the 54 flags of African countries. Green symbolizes to us Africa. And we see ourselves as descendants who came from Europe more than 360 years ago, who has made Africa our fatherland and our home. We are part and parcel of Africa. If I can stay 1 minute, in the last minute I've got with the legacy of former President Mandela, and let's quickly look at some of that. Integrity. What has happened to integrity in South Africa and in Africa in general? Respect for human rights as a legacy of President Mandela. President Mandela was prepared to stand up against the government of General Sani Abacha in Nigeria and to express his outrage when they executed Ken Saro-Wiwa, the well-known Nigerian writer. What about President Mandela's respect for the law, for the rule of law? He was prepared when he was subpoenaed to go to the court and did what he did. He did not go and use money to stay out of court. What happened in terms of President Mandela's plight and his absolute point of view with regard to non-racialism? We cannot allow people in South Africa to drive a racial agenda from any side. We should take further the whole concept of non-racialism and make a success of that. We are committed to South Africa. We are committed to Africa. We are Africans, and we take the hands of our fellow Africans, and we'll make a success of that. Thank you very much.
Honorable Carter.
Thank Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, as I start, I think of a song by one of our local bands, the Southern Gypsy Queens. Africa is where my heart is. Africa is where my soul is. Africa is where I belong. Now, Chair, our transition to democracy in 1994 and the moral standing of Nelson Mandela bestowed upon us substantial moral authority in the world. It afforded us the ability to speak out about human rights abuses, abuses of power in world affairs, and the marginalization of the world's poor and vulnerable. In Africa, we spearheaded continental reforms, including the introduction of key institutions, the frameworks like the African Union, the Pan-African Parliament, the new Partnership for Africa's Development, and the African Peer Review Mechanism, all of which emphasized our then leading role in Africa as a whole and as an advocate for transparency, accountability, good governance, and responsible leadership. Now, Chairperson, South Africa had a tradition of advocating a worldview that hinged on the example that it set through its own actions. We have sadly soiled the legacy of Madiba and lost our international credibility, continentally and internationally. Incidents such as the Marikana massacre and the horror and torture of Esidimeni, incidents of gross xenophobia and the denial thereof, have fouled our human rights standing and our standing in Africa. We've seen a decade of bad governance, the mismanagement of our economy and its stagnation, and the resultant downgrade to junk status has impacted on our standing as an emerging power. Our foreign policy, once underpinned by the values of our Constitution and the morality of our inaugural president, a human rights-based approach, has in the last decade been tarnished, as evidenced by the fact that our government appears to value its relations with pariah states more than it does its commitment to human rights. A voting record on the United Nations Human Rights Council, where a clear pattern of opposition to essential human rights is to be observed. The ANC and government's determination to withdraw from the International Criminal Court following the al-Bashir scandal, and this despite most of other African countries vocally supporting and not leaving the ICC. Chair, the question that arises is, can we, for the sake of the legacy of Madiba, restore our worldly image and status and influence for good, such in the field of human rights? And can we regain our influence in Africa and strengthen Africa's institutions and help improve governance with our continent as we did in the era of Nelson Mandela? Thank you.
Thank you. Honorable Swart.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, the ACDP welcomes this Africa Day debate on the rich legacy that former President Mandela has left not only us, but also for Africa and the world. He said, "We understand it is still that there is no easy road to freedom. We know it well that none of us acting alone can achieve success. We must therefore act as a united people for national reconciliation, for nation building, for the birth of a new world. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all." And so through years of imprisonment and deprivation, he held fast to his hope and faith that South Africa would be free and could be, and there would be a better world, and of course included in that is a better Africa. His ultimate legacy is, however, the power of love. We can choose forgiveness over anger, courage over cowardice, but most of all, love over hate. And he most famously said, "No one is born hating another person because of the color of his skin. People must learn to hate, and if so, they can also learn to love." So what happened to this dream and vision, not only for Africa, but for South Africa? We see deep divisions, wars, corruption, terrorism in various African countries, but there are some great success stories. South Africa, however, as was indicated during the presidential debate, seems to be becoming more deeply polarized along race and class divides, fueled by popular rhetoric against a background of gross inequality, poverty, and inequality. The question we need to ask ourselves as responsible leaders in Africa is, to quote a well-known band, a hip-hop band, the Black Eyed Peas, where is the love? And their lyrics is, if you only have love for your own race, then you only have space to discriminate. And to discriminate only generates hate. And there's a beautiful prayer, Father, Father, help us, send some guidance from above. Where is the love? And as a believer and as an African celebrating Africa Day today, I would urge all of us to lead the charge by saying, here is the love. No more xenophobic attacks on fellow Africans seeking refuge in our country. After all, Jesus commands us to love one another. He says, as I have loved you, so must you love one another. And some in this house have said, the time for reconciliation is past. Now it is a time for justice. The ACDP believes that justice and restitution can and must play an important role. However, when it will always be for us that we need to have a ministry of reconciliation. First, man to God, and then man to man. And we are also called to be peacemakers. We are the peacemakers. Jesus said, blessed be the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. We need to silence the guns on the continent and silence the guns in our own nation that are used by criminals. So love looks like something. I thank you.
Thank you. Honorable the Deputy Minister of International Relations and Cooperation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Greetings to honorable members and members of the executive. Honorable Speaker, I would like us to join the President, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa, and the Minister of International Relations, Umamusi Sulu, in their condolences to the family of the late liberation struggle veteran, Ubaba Edi Funde, and also the Nzima family, as well as the Stofile families. I'm honored to be afforded the opportunity to participate in this commemorative debate on Africa Day. I'm particularly pleased at the theme under which this discussion takes place: the year of Nelson Mandela, a better Africa and a better world, because it talks to the challenges that South Africa faces and Africa faces. I'm proud that today we can celebrate the gains of our struggle for liberation from Cape to Cairo. I share the view of Akwasi Aidu of Senegal when he said, Africa Day is like no other day because it symbolizes in a very practical way our collective spirit and search for unity and dignity. As we celebrate the centenary of Nelson Mandela, it is imperative that we remember that our own destiny and future can never be divorced from that of the continent. From Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana to our own son of the soil, Holy Tata, one can only marvel at the depth of wisdom and patriotism that these thought leaders expressed in their call for African renaissance, in calling for unity in diversity, peace, and tolerance. Deputy Speaker, our founding fathers of the Organization of African Unity, now AU, envisaged an African continent that is independent, united, peaceful, and prosperous. This vision was exemplified through the long struggle for liberation of the African continent. While the primary agenda of decolonialization has been realized with only Western Sahara still under the colonial occupation by Morocco, the continent is still lagging in terms of economic emancipation of the African child. We will continue to play our part in conflict resolution in those countries that are still plagued by pockets of instability and conflict. In addition, South Africa reaffirms its continued solidarity to assist the people of Western Sahara in pursuit of their alienable right to self-determination and decolonialization. South Africa remains steadfast in its rejection of all acts of terrorism and extremism that have increasingly affected countries on our continent, contributing negatively on internal instability. It was anticipated that the readmission of Morocco into the AU would expedite the resolution of this dispute. However, the contrary prevails. To this end, we We will continue to lobby all African Union members and the broader international community to expedite the resolution of the Sahrawi question. As South Africa will also continue with our conflict and mediation processes in South Sudan until we find lasting peace to Africa's youngest nation. As you may be aware, this year marks 30 years of the Battle of Quito. Nelson Mandela regarded as a milestone in question to end the tyranny and colonialism and apartheid. Our ionic leader, in reflecting on his impression on the Quito Carnaval battle during his visit to Cuba on the occasion of the 38th celebration on the Moncada victory, he said, "I was in prison when I first heard of the massive assistance that the Cuban internationalist forces provided to the people of Angola on such a scale that one hesitated to believe. When the Angolans came under combined attack of South African CIA financed and FNLA mercenaries, UNITA and Zairian troops in 1975. We in Africa are used to being victims of countries wanting to carve up our territory and subvert our sovereignty. It is unparalleled in African history to have another people rise to the defense of one of us." Close quote. Chairperson, Deputy Speaker, we continue to be encouraged by the internationalist spirit and character of the Cuban people, and we are forever indebted to them. We have presented our candidature, Deputy Speaker, to serve as Africa's rotational non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council for the period 2019 to 2020. We are honored that the African Union has endorsed our candidature. We will use this seat to achieve Africa's goal. In carrying out the legacies of President Mandela and O.R. Tambo of democracy and equality, South Africa will also prioritize the transformation of the system of global governance based on Africa's common position, famously known as the Ezulwini Consensus, to make the system more responsive to the needs of the developing countries and ensure fair representation in global governance structures. The reform of the Security Council thus remains a recurrent, essential element of South Africa's overall effort to reform the United Nations in order to make it more broadly representative, efficient, and transparent, and thus further enhance its effectiveness and legitimacy. Deputy Speaker, in 2018, South Africa assumed the chair of the Southern African Development Community under the theme Partnering with the Private Sector in Developing Industry and Regional Value Chains. We will continue to focus on building our political and economic integration of SADC states. We will continue to strengthen peace, security, democracy, and development. It is also worth noting that the SADC accounts for approximately 80% of our total trade with the continent. We welcome the adoption and launch of the Continental Free Trade Area in Kigali in March 2018, as well as the signing of the Kigali Declaration. The Kigali Declaration serves as a complementary political statement of unity in purpose, symbolizing a unified commitment to conclude the outstanding issues necessary for the operationalization of full implementation of the CFTA. As soon as we finalize the parliamentary approval process, South Africa stands ready to ratify. We hope that these issues are finalized timeously so that we may be in a position to sign the CFTA at the end of July 2018 in the African Union Summit in Mauritania. Deputy Speaker, South Africa joined the BRICS formation to advance our foreign policy objectives that are predicated on leveraging our international agreement for domestic gains, promotion of African agenda, and the agenda for the Global South. These objectives informs our continued participation in the forum in order to give effect to the centrality of Africa in our foreign policy through the BRICS. We hosted the 5th BRICS Summit under the theme BRICS and Africa, Partnership for Development, Integration and Industrialization in eThekwini in 2013. we have again assumed the chairpersonship of BRICS from 1 January 2018 and will conclude the role on 31 December. We understand that our identity is not based on geographical composition and that our engagement with other formations must benefit the continent. Preparations are progressing very well for us to host the 10th BRICS Summit, which will be held on 25 to 27 July 2018 under the theme BRICS in Africa, Collaboration for Inclusive Growth and Shared Prosperity in the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Thus, this time underscores our commitment to Africa's development and prosperity. Honourable Speaker, South Africa has assumed the chair of the Indian Ocean Rim Association, IORA, in October 2017 and will continue until October 2019. It has agreed that we will lead this preeminent regional body linking Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Australasia via Indian Ocean based on the elements of our theme of IORA, uniting the peoples of Africa, Asia, Australasia, and the Middle East through enhanced cooperation for peace, stability, and sustainable development. In collaboration with the new South African Secretary General of the Association, will further strengthen its work program, particularly the IORA Action Plan 2017 to 2021, which South Africa is championing to make the organization more outcome-oriented. Honourable Speaker, Africa remains home to some of the fastest growing economies in the world for 2018. This positive economic outlook provides only to drive investment to Africa, but also attracts investment for the continent. This approach is in line with the pronouncement of the President during the State of the Nation address to, among others, to host an investment summit during the year. Our department is firm in its belief that both public and private sectors from across the continent have an important role to play in this important initiative. That's why we are surprised, Honourable Deputy Speaker, if other people are saying the President has not realized his promise, yet preparations are underway for this summit. We also want to take this opportunity to send well wishes to the people of Zimbabwe, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Madagascar on their upcoming elections. As such, all hands must be on deck to help us usher in a new dawn for the continent and be true to Madiba's counsel that South Africa cannot escape its African destiny. And all of us must also honor President Mandela's dream when he said, "I dream for an Africa which is in peace with itself." And I believe that all of us, because we lift up the name of Madiba, we need to join hands and make sure that his dream must not remain in vain. I thank you, Honourable Deputy Speaker.
Rea leboga, Mem Haule. Before I call on the next speaker, I've been instructed by the shop steward of parliamentarians, the House Chairperson for members' interest, to give this message. It's important for the members that are booked for on SA Express flights that you will be contacted by the travel services to arrange alternate routing. This may involve longer travel times, but it is unavoidable as South African Express, SA Express, has been grounded by SACAA. I don't know what that means. Thank you. You know it better than I do. So, honourable members, there shouldn't be any panic. I just wanted to pass this message. Thank you very much. Honourable Gallo.
Honourable
you,
Chairperson,
Honourable Chair.
Honourable Chairperson, I'm sorry to interject.
Honourable Gallo, please sit. Why are you rising,
I'm
Honourable
sorry
Member?
to interject, Honourable Gallo. I just wanted to understand, is it good when we're debating Africa Day for members of the DA to go and fill the bar?
No.
They're all in the bar.
Honorable member, thank you very much. I'm not even... Order, honorable members, thank you very much. We are here to work, let's work. Continue, Honorable Gallo.
Thank you, Honorable Chair.
Chairperson, how
Honorable
does...
Chairperson.
Order. Babu Gallo, ngicela uhlale phasi. Mam Kata, angqale ngawe.
Honorable Chairperson, firstly, I wanted to apologize to Honorable Garlo for interrupting him. But I really think that you should rule on the matter. You cannot stand here and make allegation against any member for being in a bar. So therefore, I think it needs to be withdrawn.
Honorable Carter, I have ruled and said that is not a point of order and I want to leave it at that.
But then she should withdraw it, Chairperson. She must withdraw
Honorable
that.
member, no. Take your seat. Thank you.
Chairperson, so in future I can say that the minister
Honorable
is sitting
Carter,
in
I'm
the
going
pub.
to switch off your mic. I asked you to sit down.
Is it parliamentary,
No,
Chairperson?
sorry, ma'am. I said it's not a point of order. That suffices. That's my ruling. If you want to challenge it, there are better ways to do it. Thank you. Yes, Honorable Van Dam.
How does the honorable member know? Has she been there herself for a nip?
Honorable members, can we please respect this house? To everybody. Order. Order. Honorable
Point of
members.
order, Chair.
Order. Babu Filtan, angisavumeli muntu ukukhuluma ngale ndaba eqeda ukuyirula le.
Ikati baninzi abantu bebeye ebharini.
Thula baba, ngiyaqhubeka mina. Qhubeka Babu Gallo.
Honorable Chair, the 1885 Berlin Conference, which balkanized the territorial integrity of the African continent, turned Africans into vagabonds and pariahs in their own land. When Kwame Nkrumah cautioned that, as I quote, colonialism and its attitudes die hard, like the attitudes of slavery, whose hangover still dominates behavior in certain parts of the Western Hemisphere, he was ravishing the remnants of the old order that refuses to dissipate. The land question conjures up this passage in South Africa. The African dream is pregnant with untold possibilities, and Africa is on the rise as the pulse of our creative spirit. The vision that President Nelson Mandela touted of gender parity is espoused in Rwanda. Rwanda has made great strides in breaking the cycles of grinding inequality and despair engulfing its women populace. It is ranked number 2 in the world on women participation in the workforce, topping countries such as Australia, South Africa, and the United States of America. Africa is not without challenges. It is ravaged by cult militia, war crimes, corruption, terrorist insurgency, civil disobedience, regional disintegration, and poor leadership. Just recently, we have seen Pierre Nkurunziza of Burundi unilaterally extending his term of office to 2034 through the so-called referendum. Under his rule, 1,200 civilians have been killed, while 400,000 have been forced from their homes. Yahya Jammeh of Gambia had to be taken out by the economic community of West African states to vacate the office. In Ivory Coast, Laurent Gbagbo was pushed